December 8, 1941, Kota Baru, British Malaya, 12:25 a.m. Japanese troops of the 25th Army came ashore under naval gunfire less than 2 hours before the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor across the international date line, meaning the Pacific War, in the strictest chronological sense, didn't begin in Hawaii. It began here, on a beach in Malaya, with General Tomoyuki Yamashita's men moving faster than any Allied commander in the region believed was physically possible. What followed over the next 10 weeks became one of the most one-sided campaigns of the entire war. Yamashita's forces pushed roughly 650 miles down the Malay Peninsula in 55 days, riding bicycles down jungle roads the British had judged impassable for any organized army, outflanking prepared defensive lines from directions no one had planned for, and forcing continuous retreat from a British and Commonwealth garrison that outnumbered them. On February 15, 1942, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered Singapore, Britain's supposedly impregnable fortress, along with roughly 80,000 troops. Winston Churchill would later call it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British military history. 3 months earlier, Japanese forces had done something almost as fast in the Philippines. 3 months after that, they'd swept through Burma and pushed British and Chinese forces into a brutal, disease-ridden retreat toward India, closing the Burma Road and cutting off a critical supply line to China. By the middle of 1942, the Japanese Empire controlled more territory, seized faster than almost any military power in modern history. A run of conquest so rapid that Allied commanders in Southeast Asia had, by their own later admission, started to treat Japanese jungle superiority as an almost unbeatable fact of the terrain itself. That's the part of this story most people already know. What most people don't know is what happened about a year later, in the same jungles, when a single unconventional British brigadier decided to test whether that reputation was actually true, or whether it was simply that no one had tried to fight the Japanese army on its own terrain, using its own methods, and refusing to retreat when the textbook said retreat was the only option. Before we get into what he built and what it did to Japanese confidence in that jungle, I want to ask you something, because this channel only works because of the people watching it. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in it. Burma is one of the least remembered fronts of the entire war in the West, and if your family has a story from it, I'd genuinely like to hear it. Now, back to the jungle. His name was Orde Wingate, a British Army brigadier with a reputation, even among his own superiors, for being difficult, unconventional, and borderline obsessive. Before Burma, he'd led irregular guerrilla forces in Palestine in the late 1930s and in Ethiopia in 1941, developing a doctrine that most conventional officers considered reckless. That small, self-sufficient columns of infantry, dropped deep behind enemy lines and supplied entirely by air, could survive and fight indefinitely in terrain that regular armies treated as an obstacle rather than a battlefield. By late 1942, with Burma lost and the Japanese seemingly unstoppable in dense jungle, Wingate proposed something that sounded to most of the British High Command in India close to insane. He wanted to march roughly 3,000 men, organized into 7 independent columns, each carrying everything on their backs and on mules, with no fixed supply line and no route of retreat, deep into Japanese-occupied northern Burma. Their job wasn't to hold ground. It was to disappear into terrain the Japanese had never had to defend, cut their railways, ambush their supply columns, and prove that the jungle wasn't a Japanese weapon. It was just jungle. On February 8, 1943, they crossed the Chindwin River into Burma. Field Marshal Archibald Wavell, Commander-in-Chief in India, had approved the operation reluctantly, aware it might end in disaster. But the unit that crossed that river that morning called itself after the mythical stone guardian statues that stood outside Burmese temples, the Chindits. Within weeks, Japanese commanders, who had spent a year treating British and Commonwealth forces as an already beaten enemy, were filing reports describing something they hadn't planned for at all. An enemy force that didn't behave like an army in retreat, didn't need roads, didn't need convoys, and didn't disappear when it should have. What the Japanese army had built its entire reputation on, speed, surprise, and jungle mastery, was, for the first time, being used against them by the same people they'd humiliated at Singapore less than a year before February 13, 1943. The Chindwin River, the border between India and Japanese-occupied Burma, Wingate's 7 columns crossed in darkness, split into a northern group and a southern group, and vanished into terrain that no Allied force had operated in since the retreat of 1942. For the first 2.5 weeks, nothing happened that Japanese intelligence considered worth escalating. Small groups of armed men were spotted moving through the jungle near Japanese outposts, and the standing assumption in Burma Area Army Headquarters was that these were reconnaissance patrols, a handful of scouts gathering intelligence before a much larger, conventional force arrived by the normal routes. Third, that assumption was about to cost them a railway. On March 2, 1943, a column led by Major Bernard Ferguson brushed aside a Japanese patrol near the village of Bongyang and blew the bridge there, the explosion rolling through the surrounding hills. Days later, on March 6, columns 3 and 5 reached the Mandalay-Myitkina railway line near Nankan, demolished 3 separate bridges, and tore up track at multiple points along the line. This while a British bomber raid on nearby garrisons kept Japanese attention occupied elsewhere. For a stretch of nearly a month, the single rail artery supplying Japanese forces in northern Burma simply stopped functioning. That's when the tone in Japanese command changed. According to the post-war account given by 15th Army staff, headquarters didn't fully register the scale of what was happening until roughly March 9. 3 days after the sabotage had already begun, and even then, initial reports were judged too thin to represent a serious threat. Once the picture came into focus, the response was immediate and disproportionate to what a reconnaissance patrol should have warranted. Railway security units and line of communication guards were pulled together on short notice, and the 24th Independent Mixed Brigade, a unit that had been holding defensive positions near Malaya against a possible Allied amphibious landing, was ordered to march north at speed to hunt the intruders instead. For entire formations that Japan needed for other purposes were now being redirected because of a single British brigade that, on paper, had no armor, no heavy artillery, and no fixed base to defend. You're starting to see the shape of this story. A numerically superior, battle-hardened army being forced to reorganize its entire rear area posture because of a few thousand men with rifles and mules. That's exactly the reversal this channel exists to dig into. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. Burma rarely gets the attention Europe and the Pacific Islands get, and I want to know whose relatives were actually there. Now, back to the jungle. What followed was brutal on both sides. Once Japanese command committed 2 full divisions to hunting the Chindits, the columns found themselves being pushed, tracked, and repeatedly engaged in close-quarters jungle actions where surprise, not firepower, decided who walked away. One of Lieutenant Colonel Lee Alexander's columns and its headquarters were ambushed outright. Wounded men were sometimes left behind because carrying them further would have meant losing the whole column, and in at least one documented case, retreating Chindits left a note for the Japanese invoking the traditional principle of Bushido to ask that the wounded be cared for. They were. The campaign was never designed to hold ground, and it didn't. By late April 1943, Wingate ordered the dispersal of his remaining columns, and the survivors made their way back to India in small, exhausted groups, many swimming rivers under fire, some captured, nearly 1,000 never returning at all. Of the roughly 3,000 men who crossed the Chindwin in February, only about 2,182 came back, and of those, only around 600 were fit to fight again. By every conventional military scorecard, Operation Longcloth was a costly failure. It captured no territory. It held no ground. Nearly a third of the force became casualties for the sake of a railway line that Japanese engineers had repaired within roughly a month. But conventional scorecards were exactly the wrong way to measure what had happened. For the first time since Yamashita's bicycles rolled into Singapore, the Japanese army in Southeast Asia had been forced to divert frontline combat divisions, troops it needed for its own planned offensive, to chase an enemy it couldn't locate, in terrain it had assumed was its own private advantage. And that single fact, more than any bridge or railway tie destroyed in the jungle, was about to change the entire strategic calculus of the Burma campaign for the next 2 years. April 29, 1943. New Delhi, India. Brigadier Ord Wingate walked into a press briefing, having just returned from nearly 3 months inside Japanese-occupied Burma, and he said something that would outlive the mixed military verdict on his own operation. Describing what the Japanese army had believed about itself before Operation Longcloth, he told reporters, the Japanese thought they had found a technique of warfare in the jungles of the Far East to which the United Nations had no answer. Longcloth hadn't destroyed the Japanese army in Burma. It hadn't retaken a single town, but it had put a crack in a piece of psychological infrastructure that mattered just as much as any bridge. The assumption, on both sides, that the jungle itself belonged to Japan. That crack had consequences the British couldn't have fully predicted in April 1943, and they wouldn't become visible for almost another year. Historians studying Japanese strategic planning in Burma have long pointed to Operation Longcloth as one of the pressures that pushed Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi and Japan's 15th Army toward a much larger and more aggressive plan, an offensive into India itself, aimed at the British supply bases at Imphal and the hill station at Kohima. The logic wasn't complicated. A single British brigade, with no armour and no fixed supply line, could paralyse a railway and force 2 divisions into a month-long chase through terrain the Japanese considered their own advantage, but then leaving the initiative with the British indefinitely was a gamble Japanese command no longer wanted to take. Better, in Mutaguchi's view, to strike first, seize Imphal and Kohima, and remove the staging ground the British would need to try something like Longcloth again, this time at a much larger scale. That decision produced the Battle of Imphal-Kohima, fought between March and July 1944. It became, by the assessment of British military historians and the National Army Museum alike, the largest single defeat suffered by the Japanese army in its history up to that point. Roughly 55,000 Japanese soldiers were killed, wounded, or died of disease and starvation during the retreat. A catastrophe brought on in significant part by the same overreach in impossible terrain that Japanese commanders had spent 1942 exploiting against everyone else. For the army that had crossed 650 miles of Malayan jungle on bicycles in 55 days, the army that had marched the British out of Burma in months, was broken in the same kind of terrain. It had once turned into a weapon, partly because a brigadier it had underestimated, a year earlier, had proven the jungle wasn't Japan's exclusively to use. Wingate didn't live to see the full scale of that vindication. In March 1944, at the head of a far larger second Chindit operation, Operation Thursday, roughly 20,000 men flown directly behind Japanese lines by American-supplied gliders and transport aircraft under his own dedicated air commando. He was killed on March 24, 1944, when the B-25 he was flying in crashed into the hills of Manipur. He was 41 years old. He never saw the outcome at Imphal. The campaign his earlier failure had helped set in motion. So, here's the actual answer to the question this video opened with. The Japanese army captured islands and entire colonial territories fast in 1941 and 1942, not because the jungle itself favored them, but because they were the only side who had trained specifically to fight in it, while everyone opposing them still thought in terms of roads, supply depots, and fixed defensive lines. That advantage was real, and for the first year of the war in Southeast Asia, it was close to unbeatable. What the Chindits proved, at a brutal cost of nearly a third of their own force in a single campaign, was that the advantage was learned, not inherent. Once a force existed that was willing to abandon roads entirely, live off airdropped supply, and treat the jungle as home ground rather than an obstacle, the myth of Japanese jungle supremacy stopped being a fact of geography and started being just one more tactical assumption waiting to be tested. It took less than 3 Russian tired, sick, and starving men under a difficult brigadier, nobody in the regular army much liked to test it. And less than a year and a half after that test, at Imphal and Kohima, the Japanese army paid the full price for having believed its own reputation. That's the real story behind a single line in the history books. They captured islands fast, but they feared what they couldn't outmarch in the trees. Fronts. If you want more of these forgotten fronts, the campaigns that don't get the Hollywood treatment but change the actual outcome of the war, that's exactly what this channel is built around. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in it. I read every single one, and it shapes what gets covered next.